So welcome to Module 1 of our course, International Business 3730. This is our special topics course in international business. And as a special topics course, as a professor teaching in a special topics course, I get to think about what are the issues of the day. And of course, we all know what the issues of the day are right now. We're seeing the world change before our eyes with the coronavirus outbreak, COVID-19 outbreak. And so in this first module, what I really want us to do is to be provocative. I want us to look at quite a provocative idea that's being brought forth by Michael O'Sullivan in his book, The Leveling, What's Next After Globalization. And the thesis of the book, almost a first principle of the book, is that globalization, as we know it, as we've sort of thought about it, is over. And we're moving to this kind of multipolar world. This book represents the opinion, well-schooled opinion, of one very intelligent scholar and banker who's looked at the world and has seen what's changing, both in a historical context and in the modern context, and said the world is moving away from globalization and we're moving to this multipolar world, and this is what I think it's going to look like, and this is what I think is important. I wouldn't have assigned you the book if I didn't think it was really good. I think it's a really good book. I think there are things we can critique, and that's the idea here. I want to provoke your thoughts. I want you to dig deep into the book and say, okay, what do I accept here? What do I want to question here? What can I build on? What can I reject? All of those questions are what we're going to be doing over the next while as we dissect this interesting and quite timely book. I think it's so interesting. One thing I found in the book that's so interesting is that O'Sullivan, he couldn't predict that this COVID-19 was coming, but he talks about, well, the world is going to enter into a substantive recession. Economic problems are going to be coming, and this is what will play out afterwards. And perhaps he didn't imagine the chaos that's at least for the short term, that's occurred now. And it's interesting. And we can read that into the book. I think we'll spend quite a bit of time doing that in our discussions. So what I'm going to be doing then is I'm going to take you through the book. And there's just to let you know, my background is my undergraduate degree. When I was your age, I studied philosophy and economics. And one thing that philosophy professors do is they start out by teaching you any work that you're doing. They teach it to you as if it were 100% true and that they fully believed it. And then only when they're done do they start to critique it. And that's because that's fair. So Michael Sullivan has presented us with this piece of work. What we should first do is try to understand it and understand what he wants us to understand and really think about that. And then once we understand it, then we can, so I say, critique it or build upon it or reject parts or reject the whole thing. And you can say, no, globalization is not dead for the following reasons. And you can do that, but it's only after we've carefully looked at it. The videos in this module will try to accomplish a couple of things. So one is that many of the lectures I'm giving you will bring us through the book and give that explanation so that we can critique the book. The other, you'll notice there's several supplementary, almost, in a sense, almost for many of you, review lectures on some of the key concepts that you absolutely need to understand if you're going to work your way through in a deep way the problems here. So what I'll be doing is I'll be stopping every once in a while and I'll say, okay, now is a good time to go back and look at these review lectures. And based on those review lectures, you'll feel comfortable to discuss the concepts. Michael Sullivan's argument is that globalization, both politically and economically, is coming to an end. The age of American homogeny is done, and we're moving to a much more sort of multipolar world. And so our goals is to understand Michael O'Sullivan's arguments, to position this in terms of international business. And that's important. Michael O'Sullivan is much more looking at this from a straight political economics perspective. He's a finance person, you'll see throughout the book. We want to position it, if we can, we want to move some of these concepts more directly on what does that mean for international business. And we want to critique his arguments, and we want to expand on this thesis so we can understand it. And we want to consider practically, what does this mean for business managers here in Alberta or Canada in general? And here's the kicker, is that how will you succeed in a multipolar world? So the multipolar world is coming. How will we succeed as Canadian business people in that environment? And that's going to be your challenge over the next 15, 20 years. Michael O'Sullivan brings strong credentials. He's a good writer, actually. I think you'll enjoy reading the book. If you haven't read it already, you'll enjoy his writing. He's a good storyteller. It's a kind of Irish storytelling approach to writing that it's really quite nice, and I think it's a nice read. You'll probably get it done if you get into it. Just in a day, you'll sit down and you can get through the book and enjoy his stories and his history. If you like the history of it, try to enjoy that part about it. It's sort of a neat opportunity we have now to have a look at someone who really understands sort of Anglo history. And he completed his PhD at Oxford. And he taught both at Princeton and back at Oxford. So I mean, he brings that credential as a strong academic background. He did leave academics and became the chief investment officer at Credit Suisse. So he spent many years in the industry, in the finance industry as a banker. So his knowledge of banking and finance that we get weaved through the entire book is quite solid. I actually personally found it explained concepts that I've always kind of sort of known, but by the way he sort of tells it in terms of storying and putting it into historical context and all of those kinds of things, I found I learned quite a bit about international finance, particularly things like these quantitative easing and other aspects of international finance. I found it's very approachable. I think for us, if you're not a finance major, I think it's enough to understand what's going on in the world. If you're an international business major, if you're going to be in business rather than in finance, this is really, I think, quite good background. And the thing to remember is that this is his take on what's happening in the world today. Right? We accept that that's it. We accept that that's where we're starting from. You always have to accept that the person who's writing a book, especially this book, it's less than a year old. It hasn't been proven the test of time, right? And so we'll be able to critique it, and it's a starting point. And if we trust that the author is approaching this honestly and intelligently, there's a lot we can learn. So this book is situated quite specifically in the world that is today. A world where most people are beginning to see, particularly in the developed world, especially when I say developed world, and when he says developed world in this context, he's referring to the Anglosphere, if you will, and Europe. I think people are becoming quite disillusioned with our political institutions. We're seeing that there's a kind of, he uses this word, is really interesting. Another thing he does that's really interesting in this book, you'll see, is that he takes economics and business terms and then moves them into political economy. And I think that's really good for us as those of us who study business, because those words are familiar to us. Words like, he says there's a political recession. We understand what a recession is. And he uses a lot of those phrases, and I think it's quite good. We're seeing the quality of our institutions, our political institutions, deteriorating, and some, particularly international institutions, becoming quite irrelevant. There's a whole chapter in the book that sort of takes you through why he thinks many of the of the global institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and those kinds of institutions are becoming, the World Trade Organization, are becoming obsolete. And he takes us through that. It's really kind of interesting. We'll get to that later. And there's a sense that there's a growing sort of chaos and disorder in the world. And this is really different than when in the early 90s, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in economics. We saw the world as becoming more and more and more and more orderly rather than less so. As we watched the fall of communism and all of those kinds of things, we thought, oh, it's over. The free market and democracy has totally won, and now it's a matter of just building on that. And there might be some bumps in the road, but you know, the idea that we would come to the end of an American century didn't dawn on anyone. Everyone thought the American century would be one more anyways, at least another 100 years of American dominance and Anglo dominance anyways. And so I think that's what's creeping up. There's sort of a less acceptance of that by most people. So we're definitely seeing a retreat from globalization, right? Especially, I mean, immediately in terms of trade. I mean, obviously there's a picture of Trump here. And we can just imagine him ranting against free trade and this terrible unfair deal that the Americans have gotten in free trade. And I'll come back to this as well in the lectures. And the one thing I'll emphasize later, and we won't spend too much time on it now, but I'll emphasize later, is that Donald Trump is not a cause of anything. That's not necessarily true. But anyway, overall, he's not a cause of anything. Donald Trump is a symptom. And he's responding to what people are feeling and what people are actually experiencing. And so this is important to understand. And it's important to sort of context, put this in context when we're reading the book. People are feeling a retreat from liberal democracy. And in fact, the idea of liberal democracy and, you know, sort of a total sort of commitment to the promotion of voting rights and ensuring institutions become more and more democratic. We seem to be backing off from that. And we'll see later in the book, we're getting examples throughout the world where, well, maybe there is success. You can be quite successful in China. China's been quite successful without a liberal democracy. What about Russia? Russia seems, I don't know if success is the right word, but they're certainly functioning without what seems like a proper liberal democracy. We're seeing a retreat in some ways from the spread of ideas in an open and honest way, this notion of fake news. He doesn't use the word fake news, but we can if we want throughout the book and how that, as we critique and expand our ideas, you could think about this notion of fake news and what does that mean for business and how will we sort of respond to that. And obviously, we're seeing a great retreat from and we're going to see more and more and more of this from the flow of people, right? As I speak now, all the borders are shut. Now, of course, this is temporary with the you know, if you're watching this in a year or two, perhaps this has all become history. But with the COVID-19 virus, but that's only one incident. Overall, we're definitely seeing a restriction in the flow of people. We're certainly seeing a heightened desire to restrict people, migration. At the same time, with climate change, we're seeing probably a greater need for the movement of people. And so these will be tensions. In the economics and finance markets, we're certainly seeing recessions. We're definitely in a recession now, and a notion of true sort of wage stagnation and wealth stagnation amongst the sort of, at least, it's funny to say bottom 90%, right? That yes, a substantive number of people, maybe 10% of the world, in the developed world, are becoming substantially more wealthy, but others, those who work, are not necessarily seeing this. And what's really interesting is that the developing world is not necessarily experiencing this in the same way. They're experiencing growth. And we don't know how long that will last for, but they have been experiencing that. So it sets up this really sort of tension between the developed world and the developing world in terms of what we see as our growth potential and our sort of the quality of life going forward. And people are becoming much more acutely aware of inequality, that there's a growing amount of inequality between haves and have-nots. What you're going to really notice in this book, so like if you look through the chapters, all the chapters he's embedded with a kind of historical meaning. And I personally really like this. I hope you enjoy it as you read, that takes this incredible sort of interdisciplinary perspective on these ideas. He's almost in some ways coming at it as a historian, but he's not a historian, right? He's just a person who reads history and enjoys history. And he's a finance person, but he's embedding so much of history of finance and democracy and the development of these sort of fundamental ideas into what's going on now, that it really helps us contextualize it. And he's done, I think, quite cleverly. He's tried to use these historical sort of either characters or situations to title each chapter. And the leveling itself is really interesting. These idea of the levelers. These levelers, as we'll see, were these kind of pro-democracy individuals who, I mean, I suppose ultimately failed in a sense, in that they didn't seize power. But this was a group of people who, at the sort of very beginning of British constitutional democracy, were pushing for what became eventually some of the core aspects of what underline English institutions nowadays. So, yeah, he uses these terms as levelers, and you'll see that throughout the book. You'll get to learn kind of in depth who these levelers are, and then sort of he goes through this. The chapter 2 is an interesting quote from Warren Buffett and we'll look at that. And the book sort of, it's not one thing to watch about this book. It's not exactly progressive. Like it doesn't just. Each chapter just doesn't build and build and build. It takes little topics and develops them, and then he loops them back in. So just watch as you read that, right? It's a bit, runs in a bit of a circle, if you will. He picks up information and then uses it later. So there's a total of 11 chapters, and we're going to come back and we're going to study them in little groups, like chunks of the chapters. And I'm going to get you as students to do a lot of really interesting work here. You're going to read through the chapters. You're going to sort of figure out exactly what he's trying to get at. You'll see in my lectures here, I'm only going to touch just a few topics, things that I kind of found interesting. You know, I found this interesting and I found that interesting about the chapter of the book. And I'm going to present those to you. I think most of what I maybe present to you are sort of the fundamental sort of ideas that are in the book. But you're going to take it much further and you're going to hone in on some of the really interesting details in these chapters, and we're going to discuss them. And we're going to use our time to discuss these and to develop questions. And one thing I'd really like to, and I probably will say this all kinds of different times over the course of this course, is I am absolutely less concerned with the qualities of the answers that you provide. What I'm really, really, really concerned about is the quality of the questions that you ask and your justification for asking those questions. And it's not so important to get to an answer. It's important to bring up provocative, interesting questions that you can think about solving over the next long time, over the next few years. And in your mind, you have to always remember, yes, we're reading political economy here in this special topics course, but ultimately we're in a business school. Ultimately, you guys are going to go into business. And so what do these mean? What are these ideas in political economy going to mean for you functioning in the world where you're going to be trying to generate revenue, try to create jobs, trying to move this economy forward? All of us working together are going to need to repair what's going to be an incredible amount of damage that has been caused by this coronavirus. And the world is changing. And of course, what I think is really interesting maybe about if put all these chapters together is this all has happened before. And I think that's really important for you to remember. And I think hopefully the book at least gives you that sort of solace. We've been through exactly the same kind of, globalization has ended before. Wars have wiped out tens of millions of people before, and we pick up the pieces. And I think maybe you guys even, maybe less than me, you know, I'm a 50-year-old fellow here. And if you look back on my history, right? I've lived through a relatively peaceful and prosperous time. So, you know, people in my generation think maybe it's perhaps impossible that we're going to have to, you know, to pick up the pieces. And I think as business leaders, that's what you're going to have to do. So that's what this one of the sort of the gist, sort of the pushes of this book. When you're reading it, I really want you to take away from that. So I'm going to end this sort of introductory lesson to the module here. And what I want to encourage you to do is to go and to read some of the lectures that I've provided for you, which are much more backgrounding. And so some of you may say, well, this is really, these are concepts that I really need to learn. Understanding differences in political economy, considering economic size and success, and how do we measure that, and looking at all the different ways we measure that. Why did globalization happen in the way it did now? What are the critiques of globalization, the so-called globalization debate? And there was one more lecture that I want you to look at is how do governments intervene in trade, and how do governments involve themselves in trade, and why do they do that, and what are sort of the benefits and drawbacks of that. You'll see all these lectures in the module. And I really want you to go through each of them. Each, you know, they range from 15 to 20 minutes, and go through these lectures and try to understand these concepts. And in terms of, like, is it on the test? It's on the test, if you will, in so much as I'm going to expect that you have a good, strong working knowledge of all the concepts that are in those lectures, and that I could just refer to it, perhaps even in an exam question or in our discussions and all of those kinds of things. And you'd be able to sort of use those concepts. So that's the background that we need to understand. And if you're an international business major, you'll find some of it a little bit sophomoric. Maybe you say, oh yeah, you know, we've studied that. But it's worth a review. And if you're not an international business major, you may want to look at these, because your colleagues who are will have a sense of these concepts. Okay, so do that, and then come back, and we'll keep working through the book.